This is a historical narration, not a record of exact dates, but a story about how systems quietly formed, and why we still live inside them. These episodes are not about winners or records, but about how structure slowly entered human life, changed behavior, and learned how to stay. Before sport had rules, it had movement. Before competition had officials, it had agreement. Before games had schedules, they had gatherings. Before results were recorded, people tested themselves simply to feel what their bodies could do. Play is older than sport. It appears wherever humans live, close enough to share energy and safe enough to spend it. People run for the sensation of speed. They wrestle to test strength. They throw, jump, balance and endure because the body seeks limits. This story begins before leagues, before nations, and before organized competition. It begins in a world where physical challenge was not separate from life. Movement was survival, expression, and connection all at once. Play was not scheduled, it was not standardized. It did not belong to spectators. It happened when people gathered, when energy overflowed, and when survival allowed room for expression. This episode explores the long stretch of time when play existed without systems, when no structure preserved it, and no authority kept it the same. In its earliest form, play was not separate from life. Long before sport existed as a concept, physical challenge emerged naturally from survival. Running meant escape, sprinting meant pursuit. Strength meant carrying, lifting, and defending. Accuracy meant food. Balance meant endurance. These movements were necessary before they were playful. But when survival needs were met, the body still wanted to move. People repeated the same motions that kept them alive, not because they had to, but because repetition itself created meaning. This is where play began. Movement that is no longer only necessary, but chosen. Early play was informal and temporary. A race might begin because someone challenged someone else, or because a group felt restless. A wrestling match might happen to release tension, to test strength, or simply because physical contact is part of human bonding. Throwing contests appeared because accuracy was admired and difficulty was respected. There were no fixed rules. Agreements were made in the moment and adjusted as needed. If someone felt a contest had gone too far, it stopped. If someone felt disadvantaged, the group negotiated. The boundary between play and conflict was managed socially, not formally. Outcomes were not recorded. There were no lasting scores. A person might be recognized as fast or strong, but that recognition remained personal. It did not create standings. It did not produce titles. It did not carry forward as obligation. Play served many purposes at once. It built trust by allowing people to test one another without real harm. It released tension by giving aggression a safe outlet. It taught control by rewarding restraint. It reinforced community by creating shared laughter and shared attention. Importantly, early play did not create spectatorship in the modern sense. People watched, but watching was not a separate role. The same person who observed one moment might participate in the next. There were no uniforms, no teams, no formal beginnings or endings. Play belonged to the group. Its meaning lived in the moment. It ended when the moment ended. There was no system to preserve it, no structure to protect it, no authority to enforce it. Play existed freely, and because of that, it could not stay the same. As human groups grew larger and more stable, play began to change. In small, temporary groups, play could remain loose. Everyone knew one another, and separation was always possible. If a contest became uncomfortable, the group could dissolve. Memory did not linger long enough to harden outcomes. But when communities became more permanent, people played together again and again. Repetition changed everything. When a contest repeats, outcomes accumulate. Someone is always faster, someone is always stronger, someone loses more often than others. Over time, these patterns stop being temporary experiences and begin to feel like identities. With repetition came disagreement. People began to argue about fairness. They questioned whether someone started too early, pushed too hard, or crossed an invisible boundary. Informal agreements that once felt sufficient began to fail under pressure. Play also began to matter more. When a community started to value physical contests, not just as release, but as demonstration, outcomes gained weight. Winning became admired, losing became remembered. When people care about results, they want those results to feel legitimate. Legitimacy demands consistency. Consistency demands limits. Pressure did not appear because people wanted competition to become rigid. It appeared because repetition created memory, and memory created conflict. The group wanted disputes to end. They wanted outcomes to be accepted, so the community could return to stability. As pressure increased, play became less free. Participants began to demand clear starts and clear endings. They wanted boundaries that did not shift mid-contest. They wanted conditions that stayed the same so that outcomes could be compared. The moment play required defense, it began to require structure. No one announced this transition, no one planned it, but the more play repeated, the more it demanded agreement. And agreement was the first step toward systems. This is the moment where play stopped being only an experience and started becoming something that needed protection. Rules did not appear fully formed. They emerged through repetition. Groups began by agreeing on simple boundaries, because boundaries reduced argument. They repeated starting positions because consistent starts removed suspicion. They clarified endings because endings prevented disputes from continuing beyond the contest itself. Even simple rules changed everything. Rules narrowed behavior. They separated acceptable play from unacceptable play. They reduced improvisation and replaced it with predictability. Predictability allowed outcomes to be accepted, even by those who lost. Once predictability existed, contests could be repeated in the same shape across time. Repetition created stability. Stability made preparation possible. People began to practice, not because they were required to, but because the contest was now consistent enough to prepare for. Preparation introduced intention. Intention introduced strategy. Strategy changed how people approached play. Organization also created visibility. When the same rules applied again and again, skill differences became clearer. Speed, strength, endurance, and control could now be recognized consistently. Recognition led to admiration. Admiration led to specialization. Some people became known for certain abilities. These roles were not assigned, they were rewarded. Over time, expectation followed ability. Expectation hardened into identity. As rules stabilized, environments stabilized as well. Groups began to favor certain spaces for contests, areas where boundaries could be repeated and conditions remained familiar. Even without permanent structures, the idea of a field or play space began to exist. Once a space could be returned to, the contest became portable. It could move between groups because its shape was recognizable. This is how sport spread. When a contest has a known format, it no longer belongs only to one community. Other groups can adopt it, compare outcomes, and recognize achievement. Comparison expanded beyond the local group, and with broader comparison came a new question: who decides whether the rules are followed? Organization solved many problems, but it created a new one. To protect structure, someone had to enforce it. This is where authority entered play. Once rules existed, someone had to protect them. Authority in early sport did not begin as control. It began as mediation. A trusted individual stepped in to settle disputes, interpret rules, and decide whether a contest had been fair. The role existed because conflict existed. At first, this authority was informal. It might rotate, it might depend on reputation. But once groups realized that disputes could ruin contests, the role became more stable. Stability itself became valuable. As authority stabilized, it changed the relationship between participants and the game. The contest no longer belonged entirely to those who played it. It also belonged to the structure that governed it. Rules were no longer flexible agreements. They became obligations. Decisions were no longer negotiated mid-contest. They were enforced. This shift mattered deeply. In unstructured play, the group could change rules because the goal was shared experience. In structured sport, changing rules undermined legitimacy. Fairness became the highest value because fairness allowed outcomes to be accepted. Acceptance allowed the system to continue. Authority therefore expanded even without intention. If a contest mattered, people demanded fairness. If fairness mattered, people demanded consistency. If consistency mattered, enforcement became necessary. Over time, authority separated from participation. The person enforcing rules no longer competed. Competing would compromise legitimacy. This separation created a boundary between players and the system itself. The game became something participants entered rather than something they fully owned. Authority also produced discipline. Participants began to regulate themselves. They learned how to control aggression, how to accept outcomes they disagreed with, and how to submit to decisions made by someone else. Sport became a training ground for living inside systems. This was not only about play, it was about teaching behavior. Once authority took hold, sport was no longer just an activity. It was a structure that shaped conduct. And structures once established tend to remain. Once sport stabilized, it began to do something new. It began to last. When rules, boundaries, and authority remained consistent over time, play stopped being only an activity and started becoming a tradition. People no longer encountered the contest as something spontaneous. They expected it. They prepared for it. They spoke about it as something that belonged to the community itself. This is the moment when sport becomes culture. Culture is not created by declaration. It forms when behavior repeats often enough to feel normal. Sport repeated, and because it repeated under the same structure, it began to teach expectations. People learned how to behave inside the contest. They learned when to act, when to wait, and when to accept outcomes. Over time, these lessons extended beyond the play space. Sport became one of the first environments where humans practiced submission to rules without immediate survival consequences. Winning also changed. In early play, winning was temporary. It ended with the moment. In organized sport, winning became symbolic. It represented discipline, preparation, and legitimacy within the system. Losing, likewise, carried meaning. It taught restraint, acceptance, and persistence. As meaning accumulated, sport began to generate identity. Individuals were no longer only participants. They were recognized for roles, abilities, and reputations shaped by repeated contests. Over time, those identities extended outward. Groups began to align themselves with certain teams, styles, or traditions. Belonging emerged not only through participation, but through recognition. Sport also created memory. Stories were told about impressive performances. Comparisons were made between past and present contests. Memory extended the life of sport beyond the immediate event. A contest could now influence status long after it ended. This memory mattered. Once people remembered sport, they began to protect it. Rules became traditions. Authority became respected. Challenges to the structure felt like challenges to the community itself. The system no longer existed only to support play. Play existed to reinforce the system. Spectatorship also evolved. At first, watching was incidental, but over time, watching became participation of a different kind. Observers validated outcomes, repeated stories, and reinforced identity. Shared attention created shared meaning. Sport became something experienced collectively, even by those not physically involved. This is how sport learned to represent more than movement. It reflected values: strength, endurance, control, fairness, and discipline. It demonstrated how conflict could exist without tearing the group apart. It showed how authority could be accepted, how rules could be followed, and how outcomes could be respected. Children grew up absorbing these lessons. They learned what behavior was rewarded. They learned how to compete without chaos. They learned how to exist inside a system that constrained action, but allowed expression. Sport became an informal training ground for structured life. By this point, sport no longer depended on individuals. Individuals depended on sport. The system had locked in. What began as free movement had become tradition. What began as play had become identity. And what began as experience had become culture. Modern sport feels inevitable because it is inherited. Leagues, rules, officials, records, and global events all trace back to these early shifts. Sport did not replace play, it organized it. It gave it shape, memory, and permanence. We no longer experience sport as something that appears spontaneously. We encounter it already structured, already governed, already preserved. The rules exist before we arrive. The authority is already in place. This is why sport feels natural. We grow up inside it. We learn its expectations early. We accept its constraints without questioning their origins. Sport shows us how systems work because sport is one of the earliest systems humans learned to accept voluntarily. It allowed conflict without collapse. It allowed competition without violence. It allowed hierarchy without permanent harm. And once play became a system, it never returned to freedom. It became something larger, something shared, something that could last. That is not the end of play. It is the beginning of sport as we know it. This was not the end of play. It was the beginning of a system. And once systems form, they rarely disappear.